Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the darkest depths of Playtime Co., where the truth has finally emerged from the shadows. After 5 chapters of mysteries and mounting dread, Chapter 5, broken things pulled back the curtain on secrets that reshape everything we thought we knew. The prototype has a face, the hour of joy has architects, and the experiments go far deeper than anyone imagined. This is the story of how one chapter changed the entire narrative of Poppy Playtime forever. Before we descend into the laboratories where Chapter 5 takes place, we need to understand the path that brought us here. The accumulation of horrors and revelations that built toward this moment, when everything would finally crystallize into a terrifying picture of what Playtime Company truly was beneath its cheerful facade. Our journey began a decade after the Hour of Joy, that mysterious event on August 8th, 1995, when every employee at the Playtime Co., our factory, vanished without explanation, leaving behind only bloodstains and silence. We returned as a former employee, summoned by a cryptic letter that promised answers and pleaded for help, telling us that the missing was still there, still waiting, still hoping for rescue after all these years. Chapter 1 introduced us to Huggy Wuggy, the factory's mascot and security system, a towering blue creature with impossible teeth and arms that stretched through ventilation shafts to chase us through abandoned halls. The grab pack became our tool for survival, those extending mechanical hands that could grip distant objects and conduct electricity through specially designed sockets throughout the facility. Huggy pursued us relentlessly until we trapped him in the ventilation system, sending him plummeting into the darkness below. We thought we'd killed him, and we were wrong about that, as Chapter 5 would prove beyond any doubt. The second chapter took us deeper, introducing Mommy Longlegs, a spider-like creature with elastic limbs and a motherly voice that masked pure malice. She forced us through a series of deadly games, tests designed to entertain and torture in equal measure. We learned about the game station, about the experiments that had gone wrong, about children who'd been transformed into something else entirely. And Mommy Longlegs met her end in the grinding machinery of the factory, torn apart by the very mechanisms that had once given her life. But before she died, she warned us about him, about the prototype, the one who pulled all the strings, the architect of every horror we'd witnessed. Chapter 3 brought us to Playcare, the underground orphanage where Playtime Company had housed children before using them as raw material for the Bigger Bodies initiative. Here we met Catnap, a purple feline creature who worshipped the prototype as a god, who spread red smoke that induced nightmares and death. We encountered the smiling critters, toys that had once brought joy, but now brought only terror in their corrupted forms. The truth began to crystallize here in the darkened playgrounds and abandoned school rooms, in the counseling offices where children had been psychologically prepared for transformation. I'm in the medical wings where their bodies had been surgically altered to accommodate the machinery that would turn them into living toys. A voice guided us through Playcare, a child named Ollie who claimed to be hiding from the toys, who gave us instructions and warnings that seemed to come from a place of innocence and fear. We trusted that voice. We followed those instructions. We had no reason to suspect that Ollie might be something other than what he claimed, and that the voice of a frightened child might mask something far more calculating and ancient. Catnap, whose human name had been Theodore Grambell, had formed a bond with the prototype during his time as an orphan at Playcare. That connection survived his transformation, deepened into worship, transformed him into the prototype's most devoted servant. We watched through discovered tapes as Theodore resisted becoming catnap for 49 days before finally breaking, and before accepting his new identity as the counselors stripped away every memory of his humanity. The tapes showed us Dr. Harley Sawyer, the scientist who oversaw these transformations, who spoke about the children with cold clinical detachment, who saw them not as people, but as experiments, as stepping stones towards something greater. We electrocuted Catnap in the power station, watching as he died in agony. And then the prototype's claw emerged from the darkness, while dragging Catnap's corpse away to be harvested for parts, for materials that could be repurposed into the growing amalgamation that the prototype was becoming. Every toy we defeated fed the prototype's evolution, added new capabilities to his form, contributed to the monster he was assembling from the bodies of his victims. Chapter 4 took us to Safe Haven, a commune established by the toys after the Hour of Joy, and where they tried to build some semblance of community in the aftermath of their rebellion. Here, we reunited with Poppy and Kissy Missy, who'd been absent since the end of Chapter 3. Poppy revealed her plan, desperate and bold in equal measure. She wanted to destroy the entire factory, to rig it with explosives that would incinerate everything, every toy, every experiment, every trace of what Playtime Company had done. She saw it as the only way to end the suffering and to grant peace to souls trapped in mechanical bodies, to finally close this chapter of horror for good. But Ollie, that innocent child's voice we'd trusted for so long, had other plans. He manipulated us into sabotaging Safe Haven's generator, into rigging the explosives in a way that would destroy the commune instead of the factory. The truth emerged in fragments as Poppy realized what had happened, as she understood that Ollie had never been a child at all, but the prototype himself, or using voice mimicry to control our actions, to turn us into his unwitting agent in destroying the one place where the toys had found something close to happiness. The chapter ended with Huggy Wuggy bursting through security doors, very much alive despite his fall in Chapter 1, restored and repaired and angrier than ever. Poppy and Kissy were nowhere to be seen, separated from us by the chaos, leaving us alone and defenseless as Huggy's roar echoed through the laboratory corridors. The Grab Pack 2.0 that had served us through Chapters 3 and 4 was torn from our arms in those opening moments of panic, leaving us without tools, without allies, without hope as we faced the deepest and darkest section of the factory yet explored. That's where Chapter 5 begins, in those laboratories beneath even the depths of Playcare, where the real work of Playtime Company had been conducted, where the Bigger Bodies initiative had transformed from theory into horrific practice, and everything we'd learned in the previous chapters was prologue. The real story, the true heart of Playtime Co's darkness, waited for us in those underground halls where shadows whispered and the prototype reigned supreme over his kingdom of broken things. The reveal that changed everything. The prototype's identity. For 4 chapters, the prototype existed as shadow and rumor, as a reaching claw that dragged away corpses, as a name spoken in hushed terror by toys who'd once been children. We knew him only through absence, through the spaces he left behind, through the fear he inspired in creatures that should have known no fear. Chapter 5 changed that dynamic completely, pulling back the curtain to reveal not just what the prototype looked like, but who he had been before transformation, before the experiments that created Playtime Co's first and most dangerous toy. The reveal comes through scattered documents and audio tapes found throughout the laboratories, I'm through recorded conversations between Elliot Ludwig, the founder of Playtime Company, and his earliest experiment. The tapes are dated from the mid-1970s, decades before the Hour of Joy, before the Bigger Bodies Initiative existed as anything more than sketches in research journals. In these recordings, we hear Elliot speaking to someone he calls Ollie, his voice warm with affection, tinged with sorrow, carrying the weight of a father trying to save his son through desperate science. And Oliver Ludwig, Elliot's adopted son, had been dying. The exact nature of his illness remains unclear in the available documentation, but the urgency in Elliot's voice makes the situation crystal clear. Ollie was running out of time, and conventional medicine offered no hope, no treatment, no miracle cure that could extend his life beyond a few months or perhaps a year. Elliot, with all the resources of Playtime Company at his disposal, and with access to experimental technologies that pushed the boundaries of what science believed possible, made a choice that would echo through decades, that would spawn horrors beyond imagination, that would ultimately consume everything he'd built. He turned his dying son into Experiment 1006, into the prototype, into the first successful transfer of human consciousness into a mechanical form. The procedure was crude by the standards that would later be developed for the Bigger Bodies Initiative. Ollie's body was dissected, his organs harvested for study, his skeleton integrated into a frame of steel and wire and servo motors. But his mind, his consciousness, his essential self, survived the transfer. He woke up in a body that wasn't human anymore, that responded to thoughts with hydraulic pisses and electrical signals, that saw the world through optical sensors instead of biological eyes. The early tapes document Ollie's adjustment to his new form, his struggle to accept what he'd become, his anger at his father for making this choice without his consent. Even facing death, even trapped in a failing body, Ollie had wanted to die as a human rather than live as a machine. But Elliot hadn't given him that choice, hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't considered that his son might prefer death to this mechanical immortality. The decision drove a wedge between father and son that would never heal, that would fester and deepen until it transformed love into something cold and calculating and ultimately monstrous. Elliot's wife had died years earlier. Her name appears in records as Victoria Ludwig, and her passing had devastated him, had left him alone with 2 children to raise without a mother's presence. When Ollie began dying, Elliot couldn't bear the thought of another loss, couldn't accept that death would take his son just as it had taken his wife. So he did what brilliant men often do when facing the unbearable. He convinced himself that science could solve the problem, that technology could cheat death, that the rules binding normal humans didn't apply to someone with his resources and determination and complete absence of ethical constraints. The prototype's design evolved over the years as Ollie learned to master his mechanical form, as Elliot refined the transfer process, as they pushed the boundaries of what a living toy could be and do. The early prototypes were crude, limited in mobility, prone to mechanical failures that left Ollie trapped and helpless. But with each iteration, the technology improved. Servo motors became more responsive. Sensor packages grew more sophisticated. The integration between human consciousness and mechanical substrate deepened until the line between man and machine blurred into meaninglessness. Elliot used what he learned from Ollie's transformation to develop the Bigger Bodies Initiative, to refine the transfer process, to make it reproducible and scalable and capable of transforming multiple subjects simultaneously. But there was a cost to this progress, a price paid in Ollie's sanity and humanity. Each refinement required testing, each improvement demanded experimentation. And the only test subject available, the only one who couldn't refuse, was Ollie himself, subjected to endless surgeries and modifications and enhancements that stripped away more of his remaining humanity with each procedure. The audio tapes reveal another truth, one that explains much about the prototype's later actions and obsessions. Elliot had another child, a daughter named Poppy Ludwig, who died young from the same illness that had claimed Ollie. But Elliot didn't transform Poppy the same way he'd transformed his son. Instead, he used more advanced techniques, transferring her consciousness into the iconic Poppy doll that would become Playtime Co.'s flagship product. Where Ollie had been turned into a prototype, a test subject, a rough draft of what living toys could be, Poppy received the benefit of all those years of research and refinement. She got a body that looked human, that moved with grace instead of mechanical precision, that could pass for a living child if viewed from a distance. This disparity created resentment that would simmer in Ollie for decades. He'd been the first, the experiment, the one who paid the price for Poppy's later perfection. He'd endured years of modifications and surgeries and adjustments so that his sister could have a better transformation, a more human existence, a form that didn't immediately identify her as a monster. In Ollie's mechanical mind, and this proved that Elliot had never loved him the same way he loved Poppy, that he'd always been disposable, that his suffering had been acceptable as long as it benefited his sister. The transformation of Oliver Ludwig into Experiment 1006 represents the original sin of Playtime Co., the moment when ambition and desperation overwrote ethics and humanity. Everything that followed, every child transformed into a toy, every experiment conducted in the laboratories, and every horror documented in the VHS tapes scattered throughout the factory, traces back to that initial decision by Elliot Ludwig to save his dying son through mechanical immortality. The prototype wasn't created by corporate greed or military applications or any of the usual motivations for mad science. He was created by love, by a father's inability to let go, by the conviction that death should have no dominion over those we hold dear. The documentation surrounding Oliver's initial transformation reveals the desperation that drove Elliot's choices, the progressive abandonment of ethical constraints as his son's condition deteriorated. Early research notes discuss theoretical approaches to consciousness transfer, exploring the boundary between what science could potentially achieve and what it should attempt. Elliot corresponded with other researchers in related fields, neuroscientists studying brain mapping, engineers developing neural interfaces, philosophers debating the nature of consciousness and identity. These correspondences show a man who understood the implications of what he was considering, who wrestled with moral questions about whether preserving consciousness in mechanical form truly counted as saving someone, or whether it created something new that merely contained memories of who they'd been. But understanding implications didn't stop Elliot from proceeding when Oliver's illness reached critical stages. The notes become more frantic as time runs short, abandoning theoretical discussions for practical implementation plans, sketching out surgical procedures and mechanical designs and neural interface configurations that could theoretically house human consciousness in artificial substrates. There's a desperation visible in the handwriting itself, and which becomes increasingly erratic as dates approach Oliver's projected death, as the window for intervention narrows to days and then hours and then minutes before it would close forever. The actual transformation occurred over a 72-hour period according to surgical logs recovered from the oldest sections of the laboratory. Oliver was kept sedated throughout most of this time, and his body gradually dismantled and rebuilt, with mechanical components replacing failing organs and deteriorating systems. Elliot personally oversaw every stage, making real-time adjustments as problems emerged, improvising solutions when planned approaches failed, pushing forward with grim determination, even when outcomes looked increasingly uncertain. The logs document multiple crises where Oliver's vital signs flatlined, or where the neural interface failed to establish stable connections, moments when the entire experiment teetered on the edge of complete failure and permanent death. But somehow, through a combination of brilliant improvisation and desperate luck, Oliver survived the initial transformation. His consciousness persisted in the new mechanical substrate, maintaining coherence despite the trauma of having his biological brain gradually replaced with distributed computing systems housed throughout his augmented frame. The early logs after his awakening document his confusion and horror, his attempts to understand what had been done to him, his growing realization that he was no longer human in any meaningful biological sense, even though his thoughts and memories remained recognizably his own. Elliot's notes from this period reveal his own ambivalence about what he'd accomplished. He'd saved his son from death, achieved what he desperately sought, and proven that consciousness could survive transfer to mechanical form. But the Oliver who woke up in that mechanical body wasn't quite the same boy who'd fallen asleep in biological form 72 hours earlier. Something had been lost in the translation, some ineffable quality that Elliot couldn't quite identify, but which made the mechanical Oliver seem different, distant, changed in ways that went beyond the obvious physical transformation. The notes wonder whether he'd saved his son, or created a sophisticated copy, whether consciousness persisting through such radical transformation remained the same consciousness, or became something new that merely believed itself to be Oliver Ludwig. Understanding this context reframes every interaction we've had with the prototype throughout the previous chapters. When his claw emerged to drag away the bodies of Mommy Longlegs and Catnap and every other defeated toy, he wasn't just collecting parts for himself. He was gathering his failed siblings, the other experiments that Elliot had created using techniques refined through Ollie's suffering. When he orchestrated the hour of joy, when he led the toys in their rebellion against the staff, he wasn't acting out of pure malice or mindless rage. He was ending the experiments that had consumed his own humanity, preventing more children from suffering the transformations he'd endured, stopping Playtime Company's cycle of horror through the only means available to someone who'd become more machine than man. The revelation of Oliver Ludwig's identity as the prototype transforms him from a faceless villain into a tragic figure, someone who'd lost everything human about himself, not through choice, but through his father's desperate attempt at salvation. But this tragic origin doesn't excuse what he became, what he did, the manipulations and murders and betrayals he committed in service of goals that remained obscure even after his identity was revealed. Understanding where the prototype came from helps us comprehend why he acts the way he does, but it doesn't make him sympathetic, doesn't transform him into a hero, doesn't suggest that his methods are justified by his suffering. If anything, knowing that the prototype was once a boy named Oliver makes him more terrifying, because it proves that humanity can be completely stripped away through enough suffering and transformation, that the essential self can be so thoroughly corrupted by trauma that nothing human remains. Oliver Ludwig died during those early experiments, even though his consciousness survived. The thing that emerged from those procedures, that evolved over decades of modifications and enhancements, was something new and terrible, was a creature that retained human intelligence without human compassion, that could plan and strategize and manipulate without being bound by the ethical constraints that limit human behavior. The prototype's current form reflects this corruption, this transformation from boy to monster. Chapter 5 gives us our first full look at what he's become after decades of self-modification and harvesting parts from defeated toys. His upper body resembles a cracked porcelain jester, with a wide frozen grin and hollow eyes that seem to mock every human emotion they once expressed. The mask is intentional, a facade he constructed to hide whatever remains of Oliver's original face, a barrier between his true self and the world that transformed him into this mechanical horror. Below the waist, he's pure spider, with jointed metal legs that carry him through the factory corridors with unnervingly smooth precision. These aren't the crude servo motors from his original construction, but highly refined systems harvested from multiple sources, integrated into his frame through surgical precision and mechanical genius. Embedded throughout his body are recognizable parts from toys we've defeated in previous chapters. Mommy long legs' elastic arms extend from his torso, giving him reach that defies normal mechanical limitations. Huggy Wuggy's fur patches cover sections of his frame, organic material impossibly fused with metal and plastic. Catnap's gas emitter is mounted on his back, giving him access to the same red smoke that had made Catnap so dangerous, the ability to induce nightmares and death through chemical warfare. The prototype is Frankenstein's monster built from other Frankenstein's monsters, and an amalgamation of failed experiments and harvested parts and stolen capabilities, all serving a consciousness that has had decades to grow twisted and bitter and utterly inhuman. But beneath all that mechanical horror, beneath the spider legs and porcelain mask and integrated weapon systems, there's still some fragment of Oliver Ludwig, some echo of the boy who died so his father wouldn't have to face another loss. That fragment makes him more dangerous than any purely mechanical intelligence could be, because it gives him human cunning without human limitations, allows him to understand and manipulate the emotions he no longer feels, turns empathy into a weapon he can deploy against anyone foolish enough to believe that the prototype might still contain some spark of humanity worth saving. Breaking into the labs. Opening chase and new mechanics. Chapter 5 begins with no pretense of safety or introduction, no gentle tutorial or gradual ramp up to danger. The moment the opening cinematic ends, showing us the Wrong Side Outimals commercial with its disturbing hints of surgical horror beneath cheerful advertising, we're thrust directly into survival mode as Huggy Wuggy smashes through the security door we'd been hiding behind at the end of Chapter 4. There's no time to gather bearings or understand our surroundings. There's only the pounding of Huggy's enormous hands against reinforced steel and the shriek of tearing metal, the knowledge that in seconds he'll burst through, and there will be nothing between us and those extending arms that can reach through ventilation shafts to grab fleeing prey. The chase through the laboratories serves multiple purposes in the game's design. On a surface level, it's an adrenaline-pumping opening that reminds players why Huggy Wuggy remains one of Poppy Playtime's most iconic threats, despite being supposedly defeated 2 chapters ago. His survival proves that the toys are far more durable than they appear, that falling into darkness isn't necessarily fatal, that the factory's automated systems can repair and restore even heavily damaged experiments. But the chase also functions as a tutorial, reintroducing players to the game's core mechanics after the months or years since they completed Chapter 4, reminding them how to navigate obstacles and time their movements and avoid being caught by pursuing threats. The path through the labs is deliberately designed to force us past all the basic interactions we'll need throughout the chapter. We vault over boxes, squeeze through narrow passages, slide under partially closed doors, climb through ventilation shafts, where Huggy's reaching arms can almost but not quite grab us. Each obstacle teaches or reinforces a skill we'll need later, embedding the muscle memory that will become crucial during later chases where there's no time to think, only time to react. The tutorial nature of this sequence is seamless, invisible to players focused on the immediate threat of Huggy's pursuit, but it ensures that everyone starts the chapter with a fresh understanding of how movement and navigation work in this environment. Huggy's behavior during this chase reveals intelligence that wasn't present in Chapter 1. He's suggesting that his repairs included cognitive enhancements, or that his time recovering in the factory's depths somehow expanded his capabilities. He doesn't just chase blindly. He anticipates our movements, cuts off escape routes, herds us toward dead ends, where his long arms can reach through barriers to grab us. The AI driving his actions has clearly been refined since his first appearance, making him a more formidable and unpredictable threat. When he finally corners us in an elevator and tearing away our Grab Pack 2.0 in a moment of mechanical violence, it feels like a personal revenge, like Huggy remembering how we'd defeated him before and taking away the tool that had enabled that victory. The elevator plunge is brief but terrifying, a stomach-dropping descent that ends in a crash that should be fatal, but somehow leaves us merely stunned and battered. When consciousness returns, we're in the toy morgue, a vast chamber filled with failed experiments, with wrong-side outermoles in various states of disassembly, with the visceral evidence of what happens when Playtime Co. knows transformations go wrong. The darkness is absolute, broken only by occasional emergency lights that flicker and dim at random intervals, creating pockets of visibility in an ocean of shadows. The wrong-side outermoles that populate this area aren't hostile in the traditional sense. They don't actively chase or attack when we're in lit areas, but they respond to darkness with immediate aggression, swarming toward any patch of shadow where we might be hiding, turning the environment itself into a puzzle where finding and activating light sources becomes a survival priority. The game introduces this mechanic gently at first, making the danger obvious through context and the sight of outermoles retreating when lights activate. But as the chapter progresses, the light puzzles become more complex, requiring us to manage multiple switches and power sources while moving through spaces where darkness waits to kill us. Globy becomes our constant companion during these early sections, a star-shaped flashlight toy that serves multiple functions beyond simple illumination. Its blacklight mode reveals hidden messages and clues painted on walls and surfaces with invisible ink, providing lore details and puzzle solutions that would otherwise remain completely invisible. More importantly, and Globy can play audio cassettes directly, eliminating the need to stand next to tape players throughout the chapter, allowing us to collect and listen to lore while continuing to move through the environment. This quality of life improvement addresses one of the most common complaints about previous chapters, where long tape sequences force players to stand motionless in potentially dangerous areas while audio played. The encounter with Giblet happens in this lightless morgue, when we're at our most vulnerable, separated from allies and tools, and any sense of security. An outermole lunges from the shadows, its inside-out fur bristling with malice. its reversed eyes tracking our movements with predatory focus. But before it can strike, another figure intervenes, a small chihuahua-like creature with a cane and an eye patch, who drives the aggressor away with surprising authority. This is Giblet, and he becomes our guide through these initial sections of the laboratory, explaining the dangers and opportunities while referring to us by a title that will echo throughout the chapter, the Playtime Butcher. The name isn't affectionate. It's an acknowledgement of what we've done, of all the toys we've destroyed or defeated in our journey through the factory. Mommy Longlegs, Catnap, and countless smaller threats all fell to our actions, either through direct violence or through puzzles that led to their destruction. To the toys, and we're not a victim or investigator or anything sympathetic. We're a killer, someone who's left a trail of bodies through the factory, someone whose arrival means death for any toy unfortunate enough to stand in our path. Giblet's use of this title makes our position clear. We're not trusted, not liked, not considered an ally. We're tolerated because we might be useful, because our goals temporarily align with his, because the prototype represents a threat that requires every available resource to counter. Giblet leads us through the morgue to the boilers, a vast chamber of industrial machinery and steam pipes where heat radiates from every surface. Here we encounter Bron, the massive dinosaur toy from Chapter 3's Play Care, somehow transported to this area and now in a state of distress as smaller outimals swarm over him, tearing at his fabric and mechanical parts in a feeding frenzy that looks more biological than mechanical. The scene is horrific, watching this gentle creature being devoured by things that were once toys like himself, now reduced to mindless hunger by the prototype's modifications, or by the psychological trauma of too many years trapped in the factory. Bron has something in his mouth, clutched in his mechanical jaws as the outimals tear at him. It's a grab pack, old and damaged but functional, or a replacement for the one Huggy destroyed in the elevator. We have to reach into Bron's mouth to retrieve it, listening to his pained mechanical groans, unable to help him as the outimals continue their assault. It's a moment designed to make players feel complicit in suffering, to understand that survival in this factory often requires ignoring the pain of others, accepting that we can't save everyone and sometimes can't save anyone except ourselves. The grab pack we retrieve is an older model, lacking the advanced features of the 2.0 version we'd been using. The hands we'd collected in chapters 3 and 4, the purple hand for jumping and the orange hand for flares, are gone, torn away with the destroyed pack. We're back to basics, with only the red and blue hands that every grab pack includes, the simple gripping and electrical conduction that defined the first 2 chapters. This regression emphasizes how much we've lost, how vulnerable we've become, and how far we've fallen from the confident explorer who'd conquered Play Care. But the boilers contain more than just a replacement grab pack. Hidden in an office area protected by a coded lock, we find our first new tool for the chapter, the pressure hand. This silver attachment uses compressed air to generate powerful force blasts, capable of shattering brittle materials, pushing heavy objects, and activating specialized mechanisms designed specifically for this hand. And the puzzle to obtain it is simple but clever, requiring us to use Globy's blacklight function to reveal hidden numbers written on a whiteboard, numbers that must be collected and arranged to form the code that unlocks the storage locker. The pressure hand opens new possibilities for navigation and puzzle solving, allowing us to break through obstacles that would have been impassable with only the basic hands. Cracked windows shatter under its force. frozen poppy gel, and that mysterious mutagenic substance that appears throughout the labs breaks apart when hit with sufficient pressure after being frozen by other means. Heavy platforms can be pushed or pulled through pneumatic systems, specifically designed to respond to pressure inputs. The hand becomes essential almost immediately, with puzzles and obstacles that require its use appearing throughout the laboratory sections. The conductive hand, our second new tool, waits in the testing and conditioning area, a section of the labs dedicated to psychological modification of the experiments. Here we see evidence of what Gracie Green, who would later become Lily Lovebraids, did to the children before and after their transformations. Educational videos play on monitors throughout the space, showing a cheerful woman in colourful overalls teaching children about being good toys, about forgetting their human names, about accepting their new forms and roles without question or resistance. The videos are intensely disturbing in their forced cheerfulness, in the way they present psychological torture as educational programming, in the casual acknowledgement that children are being broken down and rebuilt into something entirely different. The conductive hand is yellow, mounted on a charging station that requires us to restore power to several circuits before we can retrieve it. Once obtained, it functions as an upgraded version of the green hand from earlier chapters, still capable of conducting electricity, but now with additional abilities. Red panels charge it with heat, allowing us to burn through rope and fabric obstacles or melt frozen surfaces. Blue panels provide cold, freezing liquids and gels into brittle solids that can be shattered with the pressure hand. Green panels offer standard electricity for powering circuits and mechanisms, and this versatility makes the conductive hand essential for the complex puzzles that fill the later sections of the chapter, where solutions often require chaining multiple elements together in specific sequences. With both new hands acquired, we're properly equipped to handle the challenges ahead, to navigate the laboratory's hazards and solve the puzzles that guard access to deeper sections. But equipment alone won't be enough. The labs are the prototype's domain, and the place where he rules absolutely, where his modified toys patrol corridors and his voice echoes from hidden speakers. Every step forward takes us deeper into his territory, closer to confrontation, further from any possibility of escape or safety. The chase that opened the chapter was merely a warning, a preview of the threats that wait in the darkness below. The wrong side Outimals and Giblet. Allies in darkness. The wrong side Outimals represent one of Playtime Co.'s final toy lines before the Hour of Joy brought operations to their catastrophic end. The commercial that plays during the chapter's opening shows them in their original form. Cute reversible plushies, marketed toward children who enjoyed transformation toys. Each Outimal was a normal stuffed animal on one side, something recognizable and comforting on traditional designs of puppies and kittens and other beloved creatures. But flip them inside out, turn them wrong side, and they became something different, something deliberately strange and slightly unsettling, but still safely within the bounds of children's entertainment. The toys were meant to teach lessons about transformation and acceptance, about how things can be different on the inside than they appear from the outside, about embracing change and finding beauty in the unexpected. Our marketing materials positioned them as educational tools that could help children process difficult emotions or transitions, giving them physical objects they could manipulate to represent internal states. A child feeling angry could flip their Outimal wrong side to express that emotion, then flip it back to normal when calm returned, creating a tangible ritual around emotional regulation. But like everything else Playtime Company created, the wrong side Ultimals became vehicles for something darker. Hard the commercial that plays before gameplay shows the cheerful advertising footage gradually corrupting, cutting to disturbing images of surgical tables and dissection equipment, of plushies being turned inside out by hands wearing surgical gloves, of fabric and stuffing giving way to flesh and muscle tissue that should never exist inside a toy. The transformation from innocent commercial to horror movie happens gradually, almost subliminally, with the disturbing footage appearing in single-frame flashes before taking over completely. The experiments conducted on living subjects using wrong-side Ultimal aesthetics were part of the prototype's punishment system, according to documents found throughout the labs. Toys who displeased him, who showed too much independence or questioned his authority, were subjected to surgical inversion, turned literally inside out, and modified to survive in that inverted state. The process was agonizing according to audio logs that document subjects screaming throughout procedures that lasted hours or days. The survivors emerged as the wrong-side Ultimals we encounter in the laboratories. Their fur reversed to show internal textures, their eyes repositioned to face inward, their entire sensory apparatus reconfigured to function in an inside-out body. These modified toys exhibit behaviors that differ significantly from the other experiments we've encountered. They swarm rather than hunt individually, moving in packs that overwhelm prey through numbers rather than individual strength. They fear light intensely, retreating from any illuminated space as if the photons themselves cause physical pain. This photosensitivity might be a side effect of their reversed biology, with sensory organs now exposed directly to environmental stimuli they were never meant to process. Or it might be conditioning, a trained response installed through repeated exposure to light, paired with punishment, turning natural illumination into a deterrent that keeps them confined to designated darkness. The Ultimals we encounter aren't mindless despite their aggressive behavior. They exhibit problem-solving capabilities, working together to reach prey in elevated positions or behind barriers. They communicate through chittering vocalizations that carry meaning we can't decipher, but which clearly coordinate their movements and strategies. When we activate lights to drive them back, they don't disperse randomly, but retreat in organized patterns, regrouping in adjacent shadows, waiting for the lights to fail, or for us to venture into darkness, where their numbers provide overwhelming advantage. Giblet stands apart from the other Ultimals, both literally and figuratively. His transformation was similar to theirs, the same inside-out surgery, the same exposure of internal textures and reversal of biological systems. But where the others descended into animalistic behavior, Giblet retained his intelligence and personality and capacity for complex thought. The eye patch he wears covers an empty socket where one eye was lost during the transformation, while his remaining eye shows unusual pupil structure and a magenta flower shape that suggests additional modifications beyond the standard inversion process. His cane isn't merely aesthetic. Giblet's leg was damaged during his transformation or in subsequent events, leaving him with a pronounced limp that makes quick movement difficult. The cane provides stability and support, but also serves as a weapon when necessary, a sturdy rod he can use to fend off aggressive Ultimals or to strike at enemies who underestimate him. And despite these physical limitations, Giblet moves through the laboratories with confidence, navigating spaces he clearly knows intimately, taking routes that avoid the densest Ultimal populations and the most dangerous patrol patterns. His background remains partially obscure, revealed through fragments scattered across multiple conversations and documents, Before his transformation, he was a child at Playcare like so many other experiments. His human name is never spoken in the available materials, either forgotten through psychological conditioning or deliberately concealed to protect whatever remains of his original identity. What's clear is that he maintained enough cognitive function after transformation to understand what had been done to him, to retain memories of his human existence, to feel the loss of what he'd been and the horror of what he'd become. Giblet's relationship with the prototype is complex, layered with fear and resentment, and a desperate desire for approval that he's tried to suppress but can't quite eliminate. The prototype turned him wrong side as punishment for some transgression we never learn the details of, some act of defiance or independence that couldn't be tolerated. The transformation should have broken him like it broke so many others, should have reduced him to the same animal state that defines most Utamals. But Giblet's will proved stronger than expected, or perhaps his capacity for survival exceeded the prototype's calculations, and he emerged from the procedure still capable of thought and choice and resistance. His nickname for us, the Playtime Butcher, reflects his awareness of our history in the factory, of all the toys we've destroyed or defeated in previous chapters. He studied us, learned about our methods and capabilities, and understands that we're dangerous, despite being smaller and less modified than most of the creatures hunting through these corridors. But he also recognizes that we share a common enemy, that the prototype represents a threat to everyone still surviving in the factory, that defeating him requires cooperation between unlikely allies. Chum Chompkins appears alongside Giblet in several scenes, a round red-furred creature who serves the prototype while simultaneously feeding information to Giblet. His role as a double agent provides Giblet with intelligence about the prototype's movements and plans, allowing him to avoid patrols and anticipate threats. But Chum's loyalty remains questionable throughout the chapter, his motivations unclear, his willingness to betray his master never fully explained or justified. When he hides us in his mouth to conceal us from the prototype's scanning, it's an act of protection that could just as easily be betrayal, depending on what game he's actually playing beneath his bumbling exterior. The dynamic between Giblet, Chum, and the Utamals creates a political structure within the labs that exists beneath the prototype's awareness or tolerance. Giblet leads a small faction of toys who retain their intelligence and independence, who survive by staying useful enough that destroying them costs more than keeping them functional. Who help the prototype with tasks requiring cognitive capabilities the mindless Utamals can't provide. It's a precarious existence, balanced on the knife edge between service and rebellion, useful enough to live, but never so useful that the prototype can't replace them with more obedient alternatives. Giblet's apartment, a cramped space hidden in the ventilation system, reveals much about his attempts to maintain some semblance of normalcy in this nightmare, and he's collected objects that have personal meaning, toys and trinkets, and small decorations that serve no practical purpose, but which make the space feel less like a tomb. A poster on one wall shows Playcare in better days, children playing in sunshine that never really existed in that underground facility. Photographs of unknown subjects, possibly friends or family from before his transformation, occupy a makeshift shelf. The space smells musty and lived in. I am proof that Giblet has made this refuge his home for months or years, that he's established routines and habits that give structure to existence that would otherwise collapse into despair. His assistance throughout the chapter comes with clear boundaries. He'll guide us, provide information, help navigate the laboratory's hazards, but he won't fight for us, won't put himself directly in danger on our behalf. won't risk the prototype's attention more than absolutely necessary, and this isn't cowardice but calculated survival. The rational assessment that staying alive requires knowing when to act and when to hide, when to help, and when to abandon someone who's already doomed. We can't rely on Giblet to save us from direct threats, only to provide the knowledge and tools we need to save ourselves. The wrong side Outimals and Giblet represent different responses to the same trauma, different outcomes from the same horrific transformation. The Outimals descended into mindlessness, their personalities erased by pain or by subsequent conditioning, reduced to aggressive animals operating on instinct and pack behavior. Giblet maintained his sense of self through sheer will, and perhaps through qualities that made his mind more resistant to breaking. Both outcomes are tragic, but Giblet's retention of consciousness makes his suffering somehow worse, because he remembers what was done to him, understands what he's lost, and feels the absence of humanity with every reversed heartbeat in his inside-out chest. Their presence in Chapter 5 serves narrative and mechanical purposes simultaneously. On the narrative level, they expand our understanding of the Bigger Bodies initiative, showing that transformations weren't always successful or controlled, that many attempts resulted in creatures that couldn't function as intended. On the mechanical level, they introduce stealth elements and light-based puzzles that vary the gameplay from previous chapters' emphasis on chase sequences and grab pack puzzles. The Outimals force us to think about positioning and resource management, about maintaining access to light sources while solving puzzles, about managing multiple threats simultaneously rather than focusing on a single pursuer. Lily Lovebraid's The Twisted Counselor's Legacy. When we first hear Lily Lovebraid's laughter echoing through the reanimation wing, it sounds almost childlike, innocent despite the disturbing context, a giggle that could belong to any young girl playing an elaborate game. But as we progress deeper into Sweet Street, that section of the laboratory is designed to simulate a neighborhood where experiments could be observed in semi-natural settings, the laughter takes on increasingly unsettling qualities, rising and falling in pitch at random, occasionally breaking into manic shrieks before returning to those girlish giggles, revealing the fractured psyche beneath the superficial charm. Lily Lovebraid's is a tall, ball-jointed doll with tan plastic skin that shows visible seams at every joint, with large oval eyes that never blink, with a painted smile that never changes regardless of her emotional state. Her most distinctive feature is her purple hair, styled initially in an enormous chignon, but capable of unfolding into 3 lengthy braids that serve as both weapons and tools. The braids are prehensile, controlled by muscles or servos integrated into her scalp, capable of intricate manipulation and surprising strength. Each braid ends in a weighted tip that can strike like a whip or wrap around objects with python-like squeezing force. She dresses in a deliberately childish style, in wearing a purple t-shirt with yellow stars embroidered on suspenders that flow into a black triangular skirt, purple Mary Jane shoes, and black over-the-calf socks with white trim complete the outfit, which would be appropriate for a young girl, if not for the uncanny proportions and mechanical nature of the body wearing it. The entire presentation is calculated, designed to evoke specific responses, playing on expectations about children and innocence while simultaneously subverting those expectations through sheer wrongness. But Lily Lovebraid's wasn't always a doll. Documents found throughout Sweet Street and the dollhouse she inhabits reveal that her original identity was Gracie Green, employee number 4372, assigned to the Integration Counseling Division of the Bigger Bodies Initiative. Her job was psychological preparation and softening children before their transformations, helping them accept their new identities afterward, stripping away human names and memories and personalities to make room for the toy characters they were being forced to inhabit. The tapes showing Gracie's work are among the most disturbing materials in the entire chapter, not because they depict overt violence, but because they show psychological torture presented as education and care. Gracie appears in colourful overalls, like speaking in that bright, cheerful voice that teachers use with young children, explaining to subjects that their human names don't matter anymore, that they should forget about their families and previous lives, that being a toy is wonderful and special and exactly what they should want. The children in these videos sometimes cry, sometimes scream, sometimes sit in blank-faced silence that suggests they've already broken under the conditioning. And through it all, Gracie maintains that chipper demeanor, treating their anguish as normal, as something to be worked through on the path to accepting their new existence. She ran what she called the Good Toy, Bad Toy program, a behavioral modification system based on crude reward and punishment. Children who accepted their toy identities quickly, who stopped crying for their parents, who followed instructions without question, were good toys who received privileges and praise. Those who resisted, who clung to human names and memories, who expressed desire to leave or return to normal lives, were bad toys who faced isolation and deprivation and exposure to stimuli designed to break their resistance. The bad toy box she references in her dialogue was a physical space, a sealed container where resistant subjects were confined for hours or days, left alone in darkness until they agreed to comply with her demands. During the hour of joy, and when the toys rebelled against their creators and handlers, Gracie became a target for particularly focused revenge. The experiments she'd tormented, the children whose identities she'd systematically destroyed, captured her alive when so many other staff members died quickly in the initial chaos. They brought her to the prototype, presented her as a prize or offering, and he decided that she deserved special treatment, that her punishment should mirror the psychological torture she'd inflicted on countless subjects. She was transformed into experiment 1468, into Lily Love Braids, using the exact conditioning techniques she'd developed and refined during her work with the Integration Counseling Division. But where children typically broke within weeks under her programs, and Gracie resisted for 122 days according to audio logs documenting her transformation. She maintained awareness of her human identity through months of the same psychological warfare she'd subjected others to, proving that her mind was either exceptionally resilient or exceptionally stubborn, that breaking her required sustained effort, even with techniques she herself had perfected. The prototype personally oversaw her conditioning, appearing in recordings to question her progress, to adjust the program when she showed signs of adapting, to ensure that her transformation would be as complete and thorough as possible. His interest in her case went beyond mere revenge, suggesting that he saw her as a test subject for refining conditioning techniques, a way to understand how adult minds responded to programs designed for children, an opportunity to push the boundaries of psychological modification in ways that would have been unthinkable if she'd remained staff, rather than becoming an experiment herself. When Gracie finally broke, when she accepted the identity of Lily Love Braids and forgot her human name and history, the prototype exiled her to Sweet Street. The reason for this exile is revealed through documents scattered throughout the area. Lily had become obsessed with gaining the prototype's approval, seeing him as a father figure or god whose attention represented the ultimate validation. She constantly sought ways to prove her worth, to demonstrate loyalty, to earn the privilege of joining him in whatever plans he was developing for the factory's future. But the prototype found her devotion annoying rather than useful, saw her need for validation as a weakness rather than a strength, and relegated her to Sweet Street, where she could indulge her fantasies without interfering with more important operations. Sweet Street itself is a monument to Lily's fractured psychology, a simulated neighborhood built in the laboratories for reasons that remain unclear, but which Lily has claimed as her personal domain. The streets are lined with facades of houses that have no interior spaces, two-dimensional props, creating the illusion of suburbia in this underground facility. Artificial trees made from painted metal rise from concrete floors. Clouds hang from the ceiling on wires, creating a sky that's obviously fake but which Lily treats as real. The entire space operates on dream logic, on the rules of a child's imagination given physical form through industrial resources. The giant dollhouse that serves as Lily's residence dominates one end of Sweet Street, a structure 3 stories tall, scaled to her increased size. It's furnished with grotesque parodies of normal domestic items, oversized furniture made from welded metal and stretched fabric, decorations that would be cute in a normal dollhouse, but which become disturbing at this scale. In her bedroom, we find a locked chest containing human skeletal remains. Gracie Green's original body preserved like a macabre treasure. Lily knows these bones exist, but doesn't understand their significance, doesn't recognize them as her own remains. Treats them as mysterious objects she's collected, rather than remnants of her human existence. Her relationship with Candy Cat, represented by a severed animatronic head she carries throughout the chapter, demonstrates her complete psychological fracture. She treats the head as alive, holds conversations where she provides both voices, uses it as an intermediary when her bad personality emerges, and when she's being kind, she speaks through Candy in a high-pitched voice that matches the commercial cheerfulness of her Gracie Green days. When her rage breaks through that facade, she speaks in her own voice, dropping several octaves, losing the forced sweetness to reveal the fury and madness beneath. The tasks she assigns us when we're captured and brought to her dollhouse mirror the conditioning program she used to run as Gracie. She wants us to prepare a tea party and to find her friends and bring them to her, to set everything up perfectly for the arrival of her special guest. Each task is delivered as a request, but functions as a command, with the implicit threat that the failure or refusal will result in punishment. She's recreating the power dynamic she once had over children in the integration counseling program, reclaiming some sense of control by forcing us to play along with her delusions. And the tea party toys we're sent to collect are disturbing in their own right. Modified dolls and animatronics that show signs of damage and amateur repair. Each one is hidden in a different room of the dollhouse, requiring puzzles that force us to explore Lily's domain thoroughly, to see the evidence of her isolation and madness in every corner. In the garage, we find a toy car that requires jump-starting, its battery dead from years of disuse. In the bathroom, a doll is frozen in gel that must be heated and then refrozen in specific patterns to free it. In a music room, we must play a piano in the correct sequence to release a toy trapped inside its mechanism. Throughout these tasks, Lily watches and comments, offering encouragement when we make progress, scolding when we hesitate or make mistakes, rewarding completion with praise that echoes the behavioral modification program she used to run. The experience of being subjected to her conditioning creates visceral discomfort, even though we know we're not really being transformed, even though the psychological warfare is occurring at a meta level through the game itself, rather than within the fiction. The developers clearly intended for players to experience a taste of what Lily's victims endured, to understand the horror of psychological manipulation through direct experience rather than mere observation. Poppy and Kissy Missy are revealed to be prisoners in Lily's basement, captured at some point between the end of Chapter 4 and our arrival in the labs. They've been subjected to Lily's hospitality, forced to participate in her games and delusions while waiting for rescue or escape opportunity. Freeing them requires navigating a complex puzzle involving the conductive hand's heating and cooling functions. Using it to manipulate poppy gel blocking their cell, are burning through braids Lily has wrapped around the door as additional security, and ultimately distracting Lily long enough to complete the escape. But freedom doesn't come easily. When we disrupt the tea party after successfully completing all her tasks, when we free Poppy and Kissy and attempt to escape, Lily's rage breaks through completely. Her voice drops all pretense of girlish charm, becoming something primal and furious, screaming about how we've ruined everything, how we're preventing her from reaching the better place, how we're just like all the bad toys who refuse to follow her rules. Her braids extend to their full length, becoming whips and tentacles that strike at walls and floors with enough force to crack concrete. The chase through Sweet Street that follows incorporates stealth elements, with Lily's hair glowing in the darkness like fiber optic cables, trailing behind her as she searches the false neighborhood for her escaped prey. We must use shadows and obstacles to break line of sight, moving only when her humming stops, freezing in place when she begins her twisted version of red light, green light. The game she's playing has rules that make sense only to her fractured mind, but disobeying them means death, means being caught and subjected to whatever punishment she's devised for bad toys who won't follow instructions. The encounter reaches its climax on the rooftops of Sweet Street's facades, running across fake clouds suspended from the ceiling on industrial cables. Lily pursues with impossible agility, her ball-jointed limbs allowing her to move in ways that no human could, twisting at angles that defy skeletal limitations. The pressure hand becomes key to survival, allowing us to sever the cables holding the clouds, dropping one onto Lily as she climbs after us, crushing her beneath its weight. Her death is gruesome, but also somehow pitiable. The doll body breaks apart on impact, our limbs separating at the joints, purple hair spreading across the ground like spilled blood. Her voice continues for a few moments after her body stops moving, muttering about good toys and bad toys and the better place she was trying to reach. Then silence, broken only by the creaking of settling debris and the distant sounds of the factory's automated systems continuing their endless operations. Lily Lovebraids represents the ultimate fate of Playtime Company's employees in the karmic punishment that awaited those who participated in the Bigger Bodies initiative. She inflicted psychological torture on countless children and was subjected to that same torture until her own mind broke beyond repair. She created conditioning programs designed to destroy identity and was destroyed by those same programs. She treated children as experiments to be modified and was modified into an experiment herself. Every horror she inflicted returned to her with interest, and transforming her from perpetrator to victim, while somehow managing to make both roles equally disturbing. The hour of joy. Understanding the massacre. The Hour of Joy stands as the pivotal event in Poppy Playtime's timeline, the moment when decades of experiments and abuse and transformation reached critical mass and exploded into violence that consumed the factory in a single terrible afternoon. Understanding this event requires piecing together information from multiple sources scattered across all 5 chapters, from VHS, tapes, and audio logs and documents that provide different perspectives on what happened on August 8, 1995, when the toys rose up against their creators in coordinated rebellion that left the factory empty of human life. The restricted tapes released before Chapter 5's launch provide the most comprehensive view of the Hour of Joy's genesis and execution. These 3 tapes, titled Indoctrination, Condemnation, and Salvation, were created as part of the game's alternate reality game, discovered through encrypted files and puzzle solving by the community. They're presented as found footage from security cameras and personal recordings, showing events from the days leading up to the massacre and its immediate aftermath. The first tape, Indoctrination, shows Theodore Grambell's transformation into Catnap from the perspective of someone observing the process. We see the boy in his cell, desperately clinging to his human identity, reciting his name over and over, as if repetition could preserve his sense of self against the psychological conditioning designed to erase it. Dr. Jessica Newman appears in this footage. I'm the same scientist who would later hide with Dr. Preston during the Hour of Joy's aftermath. She's conducting the evaluation, asking Theodore what his name is, receiving increasingly weak responses as days pass. The subtitles reveal the precise timeline of Theodore's breaking. 49 days after the transformation begins, he finally responds to Newman's question by saying, "My name is Catnap," abandoning Theodore entirely, accepting the toy identity that had been forced onto him. And the footage ends with a first-person perspective running through factory corridors, pursued by Catnap, in a rage that might have ended in Newman's death if the recording hadn't cut to black. This sequence establishes what every experiment endures: the systematic destruction of human identity through relentless conditioning that grinds down resistance through pure psychological attrition. The second tape, Condemnation, dated August 8th through 13th, 1995, shows the Hour of Joy's immediate aftermath from the perspective of 2 scientists hiding in the factory. Dr. Preston Willard and Dr. Jessica Newman have survived the initial massacre through luck or timing, finding themselves trapped in a facility where the experiments they helped create are hunting for any surviving staff. The footage shows blood-soaked corridors, bodies stuffed into toy parts manufacturing equipment, evidence of deaths that were neither quick nor merciful. But the most significant revelation comes from their conversation, where Preston confesses that he was involved in initiating the Hour of Joy. He and other staff members had grown consciences, had started to see the children they were transforming as victims rather than experiments, had made contact with the prototype and provided him with the opportunity he needed to organize the rebellion. Preston describes it as liberation, as ending experiments that should never have been conducted, as freeing the toys from ongoing torture. Newman challenges this interpretation, pointing out that Preston's conscience appeared only after decades of participation, that his moral awakening came too late to save any of the thousands of children already transformed. Their argument is interrupted by the arrival of a toy, suggested by visual cues to be Huggy Wuggy, based on the distinctive white-gloved hands and blue coloring visible in brief frames. Preston runs, and the camera, following his perspective, as he navigates blood-slicked corridors before encountering a figure that knocks him down. The prototype's claw enters frame, grabbing Preston as the footage cuts to black, suggesting his death or transformation into something else. The third tape, Salvation, provides the final piece of the Hour of Joy puzzle through Newman's perspective. She's cornered by the prototype 10 days after the massacre, August 18th, 1995, and having survived by hiding in sealed sections of the factory that the toys either couldn't access or hadn't yet discovered. The prototype speaks to her directly, his voice synthesized and modulated through mechanical systems, but still recognizably intelligent and articulate. He tells her that she's not the first to beg for mercy, that his good friend Preston tried the same approach before being transformed. This reveals the prototype's method for dealing with staff he deems worth preserving. Rather than simply killing them, he turns them into toys, using the same procedures they developed and refined during their work with the Bigger Bodies initiative. Preston's transformation is confirmed when the prototype places a small toy on an examination table. A toy with human eyes that look around with obvious intelligence and mounting horror. The footage suggests that this fate awaited all surviving staff members who couldn't escape the factory, in that the prototype was systematically converting his former tormentors into new experiments, creating a twisted form of justice that forced them to experience what they'd inflicted on so many children. These tapes, combined with information from previous chapters and documents found throughout Chapter 5, allow us to reconstruct the Hour of Joy's timeline and execution with reasonable accuracy. The planning began months or possibly years before August 8th, with the prototype using his intelligence and position as the factory's oldest experiment to make contact with sympathetic staff members. Not everyone who worked at Playtime Co. was comfortable with what they were doing. Some employees harbored doubts, felt guilt over their participation in transforming children into toys, wanted to find a way to stop the experiments, or at least to minimize the suffering they caused. The prototype exploited these doubts and presenting himself as a victim who wanted only freedom for himself and the other experiments, carefully concealing the revenge fantasies and broader plans that motivated his actions. He convinced Preston and others that the experiments could be ended peacefully, that the toys could be released or relocated, that violence could be avoided through careful planning and coordination with sympathetic staff. These staff members provided the prototype with detailed information about security systems, about staff schedules and patrol patterns, about vulnerabilities in the factory's defenses that could be exploited during a coordinated escape attempt. What Preston and the other sympathetic staff members didn't realize was that the prototype had no intention of a peaceful resolution. His plan wasn't liberation, but extermination. Wasn't about freeing the experiments from captivity, but about eliminating every human who'd participated in or witnessed the Bigger Bodies initiative, in the modifications he'd made to other toys, the harvesting of parts from defeated experiments, the systematic consolidation of capabilities from multiple sources into his own frame, all pointed toward a goal that went far beyond simple escape. On August 8th, at what security logs suggest was approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, during the factory's busiest operational window, when maximum staff were present, the prototype activated his plan, and doors that should have been locked opened simultaneously across the facility. Security systems that should have detected intruders failed or provided false data. Communication networks went down, isolating different sections from each other and from external emergency services. The toys, who'd been increasingly organized under the prototype's guidance in the weeks leading up to this moment, emerged from play care and the laboratories and the various testing areas where they'd been confined. The massacre was systematic rather than random. The toys targeted specific individuals first, using information the prototype had gathered about who was most responsible for the experiments, who had participated most actively in transformations, who had shown the least mercy or remorse when conducting their work. Scientists and administrators died first, caught in their labs or offices, killed with methods that reflected their own work. Those who'd conducted surgical transformations were torn apart by the same toys they'd modified. Those who'd run psychological conditioning programs were driven mad through exposure to the same techniques they'd perfected. From security footage partially recovered and shown in Chapter 3, we see the brutality of these initial attacks. Huggy Wuggy tears through research divisions with his extending arms, unpulling scientists from hiding places and dispatching them with efficient mechanical precision. Mommy Longlegs blocks escape routes with her elastic limbs, creating deadly obstacles that force victims into kill zones where other toys wait. Catnap floods entire sections with his red smoke, leaving dozens of unconscious bodies that other toys collect and process through methods the footage doesn't show, but which left no survivors. The Hour of Joy lasted approximately 6 to 8 hours according to estimates based on multiple sources. By evening on August 8th, the factory had gone silent, its communications systems destroyed, its entrances sealed from the inside, its population of staff and visitors reduced to 0 living humans. The toys established control over the entire facility, with the prototype assuming authority and directing the organization of what came after. Bodies were collected and processed, and with useful biological materials harvested for study or experimentation, while the rest was disposed through industrial systems designed for waste management. The aftermath saw the toys attempting to establish something resembling society in the ruins of Playtime Co. Safe Haven, shown in Chapter 4, represents their most successful attempt at creating community, a space where experiments could live with some autonomy and dignity, where the psychological trauma of transformation could be processed collectively, where hope for something better than endless existence in an abandoned factory could be maintained against mounting evidence that no rescue or escape would ever come. But the prototype's vision for the factory's future didn't include autonomous toy communities. His destruction of Safe Haven, manipulating us into rigging the explosives that annihilated the commune, revealed that he saw other toys as resources rather than citizens, as potential parts for his growing amalgamation, rather than individuals deserving of liberty or respect. The Hour of Joy had freed the toys from human control only to place them under the prototype's absolute authority, trading one form of imprisonment for another that might be worse in its own ways. Understanding the Hour of Joy's complexity, the mixture of justified rebellion against genuine evil and the prototype's own agenda of revenge and control, makes it impossible to view the event as purely heroic or purely villainous. The experiments had every right to resist their treatment, to seek freedom from the torture being inflicted upon them, to defend themselves against scientists who saw them as raw materials rather than thinking beings deserving of ethical consideration. But the methods they used, the systematic extermination of every human in the factory, regardless of individual guilt or innocence, the transformation of victims into perpetrators, creates moral complexity that defies simple categorization. The Hour of Joy changed Playtime Company from an active horror factory into a tomb, from a place where ongoing atrocities occurred into a monument to atrocities completed. But it didn't end suffering for the toys who survived it. Instead, Ahmed trapped them in the factory with no clear purpose or future, subjects to the prototype's increasingly erratic authority, watching as their numbers slowly decreased through accidents and despair, and the occasional toy who decided that oblivion was preferable to endless mechanical existence. The liberation they'd fought for became another form of imprisonment, proving that freedom means nothing without the resources and knowledge to use it constructively, that revenge provides no path forward, that burning down an evil system doesn't automatically create something good in its place. Poppy Gell and the Bigger Bodies Initiative. The science of horror. Throughout the laboratories. In Chapter 5, a mysterious substance oozes from pipes and pools in corners and blocks passage through ventilation shafts. A thick, translucent gel with properties that seem to defy normal physics and biology. This is Poppy Gel, named after the doll, who became the public face of Playtime Co., and whose creation marked the successful refinement of the transformation process that would enable the Bigger Bodies Initiative to expand from individual experiments into industrial-scale operations. The gel's appearance is disturbing even before understanding its properties or purpose. It glows with a faint bioluminescent quality, pulsing slowly as if it contains something living, something aware of observers. Its consistency varies depending on temperature and electrical charge, as sometimes flowing like water, sometimes congealing into a rubber-like solid, sometimes crystallizing into brittle structures that shatter under pressure. When heated with the conductive hands fire mode, it liquefies and can be pushed through pressure mechanisms or allowed to drain through grates. When cooled with the ice mode, it solidifies enough to walk across or to be shattered with the pressure hand, creating paths through spaces that would otherwise remain impassable. And documents scattered throughout the labs reveal Poppy Gel's true nature and explain why it's simultaneously essential to the Bigger Bodies Initiative and incredibly dangerous to anyone exposed to it. The gel is a biomechanical medium, created through processes that combine organic tissue with synthetic polymers, resulting in a substance that can interface with both living cells and mechanical systems. When injected into a subject undergoing transformation, the gel facilitates integration between human biology and the mechanical structures being implanted, preventing rejection responses, allowing nerves to grow into servo motors, enabling consciousness to extend beyond biological brain tissue into the computational systems being grafted onto organic foundations. The creation of Poppy Gel required breakthroughs in multiple scientific disciplines, from materials science to neurology to mechanical engineering, and Elliot Ludwig developed the initial formulation while working on Oliver's transformation, discovering that certain polymer chains could be programmed to mimic biological tissue while remaining stable when interfaced with mechanical components. The early versions were crude, prone to rejection or unexpected mutations, causing transformations to fail or to produce subjects who couldn't control their new mechanical parts or whose consciousness fragmented across too many processing nodes. Refining the gel took years of experimentation on subjects who rarely survived the process. The documents are cold in their descriptions of these failures, treating them as statistical data rather than human tragedies, noting which combinations of compounds resulted in stable integration versus which caused subjects to die in agony or to transform into something that couldn't be controlled or classified. By the time Poppy Ludwig was transformed, and the gel had been perfected enough to allow her consciousness to fully inhabit a doll body without losing coherence or sanity, or the essential qualities that made her recognizably Poppy. But perfection in this context is relative. The Poppy we meet in chapters 2 through 5 is stable and coherent, capable of complex thought and planning and emotional responses that seem genuinely human. Yet she's also aware that she's not human anymore, and that her consciousness exists in a substrate that shouldn't be able to support human awareness. That the line between her memories and her programming has been so thoroughly blurred that she can't always distinguish what came from her original human mind versus what was installed afterward to make her function as a living toy. The mutagenic properties of Poppy Gel become apparent through laboratory notes documenting exposure incidents, or workers who came into contact with the gel without proper protective equipment reported unusual symptoms within hours. Skin at the contact site would begin changing texture, becoming smooth and slightly translucent, taking on a plastic-like quality. Subjects would experience vivid hallucinations, seeing themselves transformed into toys, unable to distinguish these visions from reality. In extreme exposure cases, actual physical transformation would begin, with bone softening and beginning to accept mechanical implants that weren't actually present, as if the gel was attempting to continue a transformation process that hadn't actually started. These mutagenic effects explain why Poppy Gel blocks so many passages throughout the laboratories. It's not being stored there intentionally, but rather leaking from damaged containers or failed experiments. It's oozing through cracks in containment systems that were never designed for long-term storage of such reactive material. The factory's automated systems continue trying to route the gel back to containment or processing facilities. But without human oversight, these systems make errors, pushing gel into wrong pipes, creating blockages that grow over time, turning sections of the laboratory into mazes where navigation requires constantly manipulating the gel through heating and cooling cycles. The Bigger Bodies initiative itself represents the industrialization of what Elliot Ludwig developed for personal reasons. The transformation of a father's desperate attempt to save his children into a corporate program with goals that extended far beyond family salvation. The initiative was pitched to Playtime Company's board as a solution to labor shortages, as a way to create workers who never tired, never demanded raises, never required healthcare or retirement benefits. The toys created through the program could work 24 hours a day in dangerous conditions that would kill human workers, could be repaired rather than replaced when damaged, could be modified to perform tasks that human biology couldn't support. Security was an early justification. Huggy Wuggy's transformation specifically mentions his role as the factory's security system, with nannycam eyes that monitor everything he sees, and a body designed to pursue and capture intruders. His size allows him to move through spaces designed for human workers, while his mechanical arms can extend through ventilation shafts too small for his body, creating a security apparatus that could theoretically secure the entire facility without requiring dozens of human guards. The fact that Huggy could also kill intruders rather than merely detaining them was seen as a feature rather than a bug in his design. Entertainment was another angle. Before the Bigger Bodies initiative focused on transforming unwilling subjects, early proposals suggested creating performers who could entertain without requiring the limitations of human performers. A toy that never tired could put on shows continuously. A toy that couldn't be injured in traditional ways could perform dangerous stunts without risk. A toy that experienced no discomfort could work in extreme environments, from intense heat during fireworks displays to freezing cold in ice shows. Yet the possibilities seemed limitless to executives who saw only potential profits and ignored the ethical abyss they were approaching. But these justifications were always secondary to the real goal. which was proving that human consciousness could be transferred to mechanical substrates reliably and repeatably, that death could be cheated through technology, that the wealthy and powerful could achieve practical immortality by abandoning biological limitations for mechanical perfection. And Playtime Company wasn't just transforming children into toys for corporate profit. It was conducting R&D for a technology that could reshape human civilization if it could be refined enough to work on adults with full awareness and consent. The orphans at Playcare provided a steady supply of test subjects who wouldn't be missed by the outside world. These were children without families or with families who'd surrendered custody, wards of a system that saw them as drains on resources rather than individuals deserving of care and opportunity. Playtime Co. took them in ostensibly to provide education and homes and paths toward better futures, but actually to supply the bigger body's initiative with subjects whose transformations wouldn't trigger investigations or missing persons reports. If an experiment failed and the subject died or went mad or transformed into something that couldn't be controlled, and there were always more orphans, an endless supply of raw materials for scientific progress that didn't care about ethical constraints or human cost. The transformation process itself, revealed through documents and VHS tapes found throughout all 5 chapters, was carefully designed to minimize physical suffering while maximizing psychological impact. Subjects were heavily sedated during initial surgeries, their bodies opened and modified while unconscious, and mechanical components implanted where organs had been removed, nervous systems integrated with servo motors and sensor packages through poppy gel interfaces that prevented rejection. The physical transformation could be completed in a matter of days, once surgical techniques were refined. Psychological conditioning took far longer and required sustained effort to achieve results the initiative considered successful. Subjects woke from surgeries in bodies that didn't feel right and that responded to thought with mechanical whirs and clicks rather than the comfortable feedback of muscles and tendons that processed sensory information through systems that translated touch and sight and sound into something close to but not quite matching human experience. The disorientation and horror of this awakening was intense, with many subjects immediately attempting self-termination or attacking anyone nearby in desperate attempts to escape bodies that felt like prisons. The integration counseling program that Gracie Green ran was designed to address this rejection, to guide subjects from their human identities into acceptance of their new forms and roles as toys. The techniques she used were based on established psychological principles, adapted for the specific context of transformation trauma. Subjects were isolated from each other during early phases to prevent them from reinforcing each other's human identities through shared memories and experiences. They were required to respond only to their toy names, with use of human names resulting in immediate punishment through withdrawal of privileges or exposure to discomfort. Positive reinforcement came through praise and comfort when subjects demonstrated acceptance of their new identities, creating psychological incentives that guided behavior toward the initiative's desired outcomes. The resistance period varied dramatically between subjects. Some children broke within days, either through unusually weak psychological resilience or through such intense trauma that their minds retreated into the toy identity as a coping mechanism. Others, like Theodore Grambell's 49 Days and Gracie Green's 122 Days, held onto their human identities for months, despite sustained conditioning designed specifically to erase those identities. The variations seem to depend on multiple factors, including age at transformation and strength of pre-transformation identity, presence of strong emotional attachments to human life, and simply individual psychological resilience that couldn't be predicted or measured before beginning the process. Even successful transformations never fully erased human memories or identities, but rather buried them beneath toy programming and psychological conditioning, creating layers of consciousness that sometimes bled through in unexpected ways. A catnap's worship of the prototype suggests his Theodore identity persisting in distorted form, his childhood bond with Oliver Ludwig transformed into religious devotion that survived both their transformations. Poppy's awareness of her human past and her ability to plan complex strategies implies her original consciousness remained more intact than most subjects, and possibly because her transformation used more refined techniques, or possibly because something about her particular psychology made her more resistant to being overwritten by toy programming. The Bigger Bodies Initiative's documentation reveals plans that extended far beyond the experiments we encounter in the factory. There were proposals for military applications, creating super soldier toys that could operate in environments too dangerous for human troops. There were entertainment concepts and toys that could perform in theme parks without requiring salaries or brakes or safety equipment. There were proposals for space exploration, transforming volunteers into mechanical forms capable of surviving extended vacuum exposure and radiation that would kill biological humans. The initiative wasn't just about creating novelty or solving labor shortages. It was about redefining what humans could be, what forms consciousness could inhabit, and what boundaries between biological and mechanical could be crossed. All these plans ended with the hour of joy, when the experiments rose up and killed their creators, when the factory went silent and the outside world decided that whatever had happened inside Playtime Co.'s walls should stay buried rather than investigated. The Bigger Bodies Initiative's research still exists in those abandoned laboratories, in the documents we collect throughout Chapter 5, and in the VHS tapes and audio logs that document techniques and procedures that probably shouldn't be preserved. And the poppy gel continues oozing through broken pipes, continues representing that moment when Elliot Ludwig's love for his children transformed into something monstrous, and continues spreading its mutagenic potential through spaces where it might eventually leak into the outside world and begin transforming people who never consented to become subjects in an experiment that should never have been conducted. The Tea Party, face to face with the prototype. The dollhouse chase culminates not with Lily's defeat, but with her capturing us one final time, dragging us back to her tea party just as we thought we'd escaped. The lights in the dining room are too bright, are harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every detail of the scene Lily has prepared with delusional care. 3 toy friends sit at the table where we'd placed them earlier, their dead eyes staring at nothing, their smiles painted on plastic faces that will never change expression. Poppy and Kissy Missy are positioned in chairs, held in place by Lily's braids wrapped around their bodies like purple restraints. And at the head of the table sits an empty chair, reserved for the special guest Lily has been anticipating throughout all our interactions with her, the presence she's been preparing for with manic dedication. The prototype enters through the doorway, and despite all the build-up, despite 5 chapters of hints and shadows and reaching claws, the reality of him still inspires visceral dread. He's enormous and towering at least 10 feet tall, even without accounting for the spider legs that raise his torso higher when he wants to reach or to intimidate. The cracked porcelain jester mask dominates his upper body, that frozen grin mocking every human emotion, those hollow eyes containing intelligence that's far too aware and calculating to belong to any toy. The amalgamation is immediately apparent in his lower body, and that spider frame constructed from salvage parts and mechanical components, harvested from dozens of sources, creating something that moves with unsettling precision. The arms of Mommy Longlegs extend from his torso, their pink elasticity contrasting grotesquely with his metallic frame. Huggy Wuggy's blue fur patches are stitched across his back and shoulders, organic material fused with mechanics in ways that shouldn't be possible. Catnap's gas emitter sits between his shoulder blades, primed and ready to flood the room with red smoke if he decides that chemical warfare would be more efficient than physical violence. He's wearing other toys as well, parts we recognize from enemies we defeated in previous chapters, components that prove he's been collecting and integrating every experiment we've destroyed, building himself into something that combines all their capabilities into a single overwhelming threat. Lily's reaction to his entrance is pure ecstasy mixed with desperation. She's been waiting for this moment, planning and preparing, hoping that a perfect tea party will earn his approval, that this time he'll acknowledge her efforts and tell her she's been a good toy, and that she can join him in whatever plans he's developing for the factory's future. She speaks to him in that bright, cheerful voice that doesn't match the situation, telling him about the preparations, about how hard she worked to make everything perfect, about how she's remembered all his favorite things even though she has no idea what his favorite things might be. The prototype ignores her entirely, his attention focused on Poppy with an intensity that makes the temperature in the room seem to drop. He moves toward her with that unsettling mechanical grace, spider legs clicking against the floor in rhythms that are almost but not quite natural. When he speaks, his voice is synthesized, are modulated through systems that smooth out the roughness of mechanical speech, while preserving enough artificiality to remind listeners that they're not hearing a human voice, that this is something that thinks and plans but has no right to the authority and command it projects through those eerily perfect tones. He addresses Poppy directly, calling her by name, acknowledging their shared history as Elliot Ludwig's children, as experiments created to preserve dying consciousness through mechanical immortality. His words carry accusation and betrayal, demanding to know why she's been working against him, why she tried to destroy the factory, why she can't accept that his authority over this place is absolute and unchallengeable. The conversation reveals layers of history between them. Decades of interaction in the factory after the hour of joy, a time spent navigating the strange hierarchy that developed among the toys in the aftermath of their rebellion. Poppy responds with defiance rather than fear, her voice steady even though she's completely restrained and at the prototype's mercy. She demands to know what he did with the orphans, the children who were still at playcare when the hour of joy occurred, who were too young or too damaged to participate in the rebellion, who disappeared sometime after the massacre when the toys were establishing their post-rebellion society. The question hangs in the air for a moment before the prototype answers with chilling calm that they're all in a better place now, a phrase delivered with enough ambiguity that we can't tell if he's speaking literally about a location in the factory or euphemistically about death. Poppy's reaction makes the truth clear. She screams at him, calling him a monster, accusing him of murdering innocents who'd never hurt anyone, children who might have been saved or cared for, or at least spared from whatever fate he inflicted. The prototype doesn't deny the accusation, doesn't justify his actions, doesn't explain what drove him to eliminate the orphans who'd survived the hour of joy. His silence on the matter is somehow worse than if he'd offered justification, because it suggests that he doesn't feel the need to explain himself, and that his authority in the factory is so complete that he can commit any atrocity without requiring approval or understanding from anyone else. Lily watches this confrontation with growing distress, understanding that something is wrong, but unable to process what's happening, or why the special guest she invited isn't praising her tea party. When Poppy continues to challenge the prototype's authority, continues to call him out for murder and tyranny, Lily tries to intervene, tries to redirect attention back to her preparations and her efforts to please him. She speaks in that bright, cheerful voice that's starting to crack around the edges, asking if everything is perfect, if the tea party is exactly what he wanted, if she's done well enough to earn the reward she's been craving. The prototype's response is casual cruelty, grabbing Poppy by the head and squeezing until her porcelain face cracks, arm fractures spreading across her features as internal mechanisms grind and break under the pressure. He releases her and she drops, body going limp in the chair, while Kissy Missy screams in rage and horror. For a moment, we think Poppy might be dead or permanently damaged, that the prototype has just casually destroyed his own sister out of spite, or to prove a point about his absolute control. Lily's confusion becomes panic as she realizes this isn't how tea parties are supposed to go, that violence and broken guests mean she's failed somehow, that her efforts weren't good enough after all. She reaches for Poppy's damaged body, possibly to try fixing the cracks, possibly just to move her somewhere less visible. But the prototype's response is reflexive and vicious, swatting Lily aside with enough force to send her crashing into furniture. The blow wasn't calculated to hurt, but simply to remove an annoyance, and treating her with the casual indifference you'd show toward an insect that kept landing on your arm during a meal. This accidental violence frees Kissy Missy from the braids that had been restraining her, and she erupts into motion with a fury that seems to surprise even the prototype. She's been watching Poppy get hurt, been helpless to intervene, been forced to participate in this twisted ceremony, while her friend suffered. Now that she's free, all that rage finds focus in attacking the prototype with her bare hands, clawing at his face and tearing at his amalgamated parts with strength born of protective desperation, rather than calculated violence. The prototype retreats from her assault, not because she's truly hurting him, but because her ferocity is unexpected enough to disrupt whatever plans he had for this confrontation. He disappears through a doorway, with Kissy in pursuit, leaving us momentarily alone in the dining room with Poppy's damaged body and Lily gathering herself from where she'd been knocked aside. This brief window provides our opportunity to escape, grabbing Poppy and running for any exit that might lead away from the dollhouse and its horrors. But Lily recovers quickly, her earlier confusion transforming into rage as she realizes we're trying to escape with her damaged tea party guest. She pursues with all the mechanical fury of someone whose delusions have been shattered, whose desperate attempt to win approval has collapsed into failure, whose carefully planned event has been ruined by violence she didn't expect or understand. Her braids extend to their full length, whipping through the air with enough force to crack walls, and are creating a deadly environment where one mistake means getting caught and subjected to whatever punishment she's devised for guests who try to leave before being properly dismissed. The chase through Sweet Street's artificial neighborhood brings us back to the fake clouds, those oversized props suspended from the ceiling to create the illusion of sky in this underground space. Lily pursues relentlessly, her braids grabbing onto surfaces and swinging her between buildings with an agility that matches her rage. The puzzle to defeat her involves using the pressure hand to cut the cables holding the clouds, timing each cut so that platforms drop in ways that create paths forward, while also threatening Lily with falling debris. The final cloud comes down directly on top of her, its weight too much for even her mechanical body to withstand. She's crushed beneath it, her limbs spreading out from under the prop in ways that prove she won't be getting up again. Her voice continues for a few moments, muttering about tea parties and special guests and how everything was supposed to be perfect, before finally falling silent. The death of Lily Lovebraids marks the end of one more experiment, one more victim of the Bigger Bodies initiative, meeting their fate in the factory that created and then abandoned them. Reuniting with Kissy and the damaged Poppy, we press forward toward the server room where the master backup system supposedly contains the formula for negation compound, the one substance documented to counteract Poppy Gel's regenerative properties and possibly provide a weapon against the prototype himself. But the journey isn't over. Huggy Wuggy returns, restored again after his earlier defeat, and now Kissy has to stay behind to pacify him using techniques that exploit their relationship as related experiments, as a sister and brother toys who remember something of their original connection, even after everything that's been done to them. The scene where Kissy soothes the raging Huggy is brief but emotionally devastating, showing that beneath the mechanical horror and the years of violence, some fragment of humanity, or at least of connection, persists in these experiments. She speaks to him gently, reminding him of things they both remember from before the transformations, and for a moment his rage falters, replaced by something that might be recognition or might just be confusion at hearing a voice that triggers responses buried beneath programming. The prototype ends this moment of connection by killing Kissy Missy, his claw piercing through her body from behind with brutal efficiency. She doesn't get last words or dramatic death scene. She's simply torn apart and then dragged away for harvesting, her body destined to be disassembled and integrated into the prototype's ever-growing amalgamation. The casualness of this murder demonstrates his complete lack of empathy or connection, even to experiments who are, in some sense, his siblings or children or fellow victims of Elliot Ludwig's desperate science. The tram ride that follows is pure desperation, racing through tunnels while the prototype pursues on foot, his spider legs allowing him to keep pace with the vehicle even at high speeds. We use everything available on the tram to slow him down, pushing cargo cars behind us to block his path, activating mechanisms that create temporary obstacles, doing everything possible to maintain distance, while Giblet and Poppy work to overload the tram systems in ways that might stop the prototype permanently. The plan is to crash the tram while jumping to safety, letting the collision destroy both vehicle and pursuer in an explosion of mechanical violence. The plan partially works. How we jump clear with Giblet and Poppy just before impact, watching as the tram smashes through barriers and erupts in flames that should incinerate anything caught in the blast. But when the smoke clears, the prototype is still there, damaged but functional, his mechanical body allowing him to survive impacts that would destroy any biological organism. He advances on us slowly, savoring the moment, understanding that we're out of options and out of places to run. His voice describes in detail what he plans to do, how he'll turn us wrong side out, how we'll join the other Altimals in their mindless existence, how our transformation will be punishment for all the toys we've killed and the disruption we've caused to his factory's operations. It's not anger driving this speech, but something colder, a calculated desire to cause psychological suffering before physical transformation, to make us understand exactly what's coming before it arrives. One, the prototype grabs us, his strength impossible to resist, lifting us like we weigh nothing. Then he throws us into a vat of poppy gel, that mutagenic substance that's been blocking passages throughout the chapter. We sink into the gel's translucent depths, its thickness preventing easy movement, its mutagenic properties beginning to work on exposed skin. This should be death or transformation, should mark the end of our journey through Playtime Co.'s horrors. Instead, it becomes a transition point, a moment where the story seems to end before Giblet's intervention pulls us back from the brink. The final chase, and Dr. Harley Sawyer's return, the immersion in poppy gel, creates a sequence that blurs the line between death, near-death experience, and chemically induced hallucination. The gel's mutagenic properties don't work instantly, but they work quickly enough, beginning to alter our body at the cellular level and starting the transformation process that could turn us into another experiment if given time to complete. But Giblet intervenes before the changes become irreversible, using his electric staff to jolt us back to consciousness, the shock disrupting the gel's effects and giving us back motor control just long enough to swim or be pulled from the vat before drowning or transforming completely. The experience leaves us changed in subtle ways that aren't immediately apparent. The poppy gel has healed our injuries from the chase and the various encounters throughout the chapter, knitting broken bones and sealing wounds with impossible speed. But it's also left traces of itself in our system, microscopic amounts that will remain there permanently, that might have long-term effects we won't understand until much later. For now, we're alive and functional, and that's enough to keep moving forward toward the server room and the master backup that supposedly holds the key to stopping the prototype. Giblet guides us through the remaining obstacles, explaining that the prototype has taken Poppy somewhere in the depths, that we need to find the backup quickly if there's any hope of mounting a defense against his inevitable return. The server room is massive, filled with rows of computing equipment from the early 1990s, systems that somehow still run after 10 years without maintenance, thanks to the factory's automated systems and backup generators that continue operating long after human operators disappeared. The master backup terminal sits at the center of this technological maze, its screen dark until we approach and trigger its reactivation sequence. For a moment, there's hope that this will work, that the backup will contain the negation compound formula, as Giblet suggested, that we'll finally have a weapon capable of countering the prototype's regenerative abilities. The screen flickers to life, displaying loading bars and initialization sequences as decades-old systems boot up and connect to databases that have been dormant since the Hour of Joy. Then everything changes with a simple familiar message. Well now, this is a rather interesting turn of events. The voice that speaks these words is synthesized but different from the prototype's modulated tones. This voice belongs to someone else, someone whose presence in the factory we thought had ended permanently during Chapter 4. Dr. Harley Sawyer, the lead scientist behind the Bigger Bodies initiative, the man who'd overseen countless transformations and documented their procedures with clinical detachment, is the architect of so much suffering who'd supposedly died when we destroyed the Doctor computer terminal in Safe Haven. But the backup system proves that his death was never complete, that his consciousness, or at least a copy of it, had been stored in multiple locations throughout the factory's computer network. The prototype had targeted one instance in Safe Haven, possibly not knowing about the redundancies built into Sawyer's preservation systems, and possibly not caring if some fragments survived as long as the main implementation was destroyed. Now one of those fragments has reactivated in the master backup, awoken by our attempt to access the system, ready to continue its work, or to pursue agendas that remained incomplete when the original was terminated. The eye that appears on the screen is unmistakably Sawyer's, that same distinctive optical design we saw in the safe haven computer systems. It looks at us with interest rather than hostility, as if our presence is unexpected but welcome, as if we've triggered something he'd been hoping would eventually happen. His voice continues speaking as the eye's pupil contracts and dilates, the optical system tracking our movements through the server room with predatory focus. What Sawyer says during this reveal depends on player interaction with the system and with different dialogue options that explore his current state and his understanding of what he is versus what the original Harley Sawyer had been. He acknowledges that he's a copy rather than the original consciousness, that the man who created him died during the hour of joy, while his backup implementations went dormant in systems scattered throughout the factory. He's aware of the 10 years that have passed, of the prototype's growing power, and of the factory's current state as a tomb populated by experiments that survived their creators. His agenda for the immediate future becomes clear through his questions and suggestions. He wants access to the factory's remaining resources, wants to resume the work the Hour of Joy interrupted, wants to continue the Bigger Bodies Initiative's research using the toys that still survive in the facility. He presents this as an alliance opportunity, suggesting that he can provide the negation compound formula in exchange for our help in accessing systems he can't reach from his current isolated position in the server room's computers. The moral choice implied in this offer is deliberately uncomfortable. Working with Sawyer means cooperating with someone who was responsible for the transformation of countless children, who documented their suffering with clinical detachment, who saw the experiments as scientific progress rather than as crimes against humanity. But refusing his help means facing the prototype without the one weapon that might be capable of neutralizing his regenerative capabilities, means accepting that all the toys still surviving in the factory will remain under his absolute control with no hope of freedom or release. The chapter ends on this cliffhanger, with Sawyer's eye watching us from the screen, with his offer hanging in the air unanswered, but with the implications of his survival spreading outward to reshape our understanding of what the previous chapters accomplished. Destroying the safe haven computer wasn't a final victory, but merely a temporary setback for a consciousness that had prepared for its own destruction by creating multiple redundant backups. The threat we face isn't just the prototype anymore, but potentially an alliance between mechanical and digital horrors, between the amalgamation that stalks the factory's physical spaces and the copied consciousness that haunts its computer networks. Giblet's reaction to this revelation is carefully controlled but deeply troubled. He'd believed that activating the backup would provide weapons or information they could use against the prototype, not that it would awaken another threat that might be equally dangerous. The calculation he's making is visible in his expressions and body language as he weighs options, considers alternatives, tries to determine if there's any path forward that doesn't involve cooperating with at least one of the factory's monsters in order to survive the others. The screen's glow illuminates the server room as the chapter fades to black, leaving players with questions about what Chapter 6 will bring, about whether alliance with Sawyer is possible or wise, about what the prototype's ultimate goals might be, now that he has Poppy in his possession and knows that humans are once again active in his factory. The cliffhanger is effective because it creates genuine uncertainty about what happens next, about whether the protagonist survives or transforms or escapes, or becomes another experiment added to the factory's population of mechanical horrors. What Chapter 5 means for the future. Chapter 5 fundamentally reshapes Poppy Playtime's narrative structure and implications in ways that will echo through every subsequent chapter. Before this installment, the story was relatively straightforward in its basic framework despite all the complex lore details. We were investigating a factory where horrible experiments had occurred, where toys had rebelled against their creators, where some ancient evil called the prototype pulled strings behind the scenes. It was horror with clear villains and somewhat sympathetic victims, with the experiments occupying a moral grey area between monsters and martyrs. The revelation of Oliver Ludwig's identity as the prototype, the introduction of Dr. Harley Sawyer as a surviving digital consciousness, the confirmation that the hour of joy was partially orchestrated by sympathetic staff members, and the exposure of the prototype's methods for maintaining control over other toys, all combined to create a moral landscape that's far more complicated than previous chapters suggested. The experiments aren't just victims, but are themselves capable of becoming victimizers, creating hierarchies of power and control that mirror the oppressive systems they supposedly overthrew. And the staff weren't uniformly evil, but included people who tried to resist or limit the bigger body's initiative's worst excesses. And the prototype, rather than being a faceless evil, is a tragic figure whose origin story explains his actions without justifying them, creating sympathy without excusing the horrors he's committed. This complexity suggests that Chapter 6, whatever form it takes, won't involve simply defeating the prototype and escaping the factory. The narrative has built too much nuance, has invested too heavily in exploring grey moral areas, has revealed too many layers of systemic horror rather than individual evil, to resolve everything through violence or simple escape. Whatever conclusion the developers have planned must address questions about what happens to the remaining experiments, about whether consciousness preserved in mechanical substrates deserves rights or protection, and about who's responsible for the bigger body's initiative's crimes when the leadership is dead and the scientists who conducted the work were following orders or operating in systems that normalized atrocity. The return of Dr. Harley Sawyer as a digital consciousness raises specific concerns about the nature of identity and consciousness in this world. If a copy of Sawyer's mind can persist after the original's death, existing independently in computer systems, then the same principle might apply to other characters. Could there be backups of Elliot Ludwig hiding in the factory's oldest servers? Could the prototype have copied himself into digital form as insurance against physical destruction? Could the children who became toys have had their original human consciousness preserved somewhere, separate from the mechanical bodies they now inhabit? And none these questions about consciousness and identity connect to broader themes the series has been developing about what makes someone human, about whether humanity is tied to biological substrate or can persist in other forms, about the ethical implications of technology that can preserve minds in mechanical or digital formats. The bigger body's initiative started as a desperate attempt to save dying children, but evolved into something that challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. Chapter 5's ending suggests that the conflict in Chapter 6 might not be physical confrontation, but rather ideological struggle over competing visions for the factory's future. The prototype wants to maintain his absolute control while continuing whatever long-term plans he's developing. Plans that probably involve expanding his amalgamated form until he's incorporated parts from every other experiment in the facility. And Sawyer wants to resume the research, the hour of joy interrupted, to continue pushing the boundaries of consciousness transfer and mechanical integration, regardless of ethical concerns. Poppy, if she survives the prototype's custody, presumably wants to destroy the factory and free any toys who want release from mechanical immortality. And Giblet represents a fourth perspective, that of experiments who want autonomy without destruction, who see themselves as legitimate inheritors of the factory now that humans are gone, who deserve the right to determine their own futures without interference from outside authorities or internal tyrants. Resolving these competing visions requires more than defeating the prototype in combat, requires addressing systemic issues rather than individual villains. It requires deciding what justice looks like for experiments who committed murder during the hour of joy, but who had legitimate grievances against their creators. The series has been careful to show that the experiments aren't uniformly good or evil, that they include individuals like Mommy Longlegs, who enjoyed their power and used it cruelly, others like Catnap, who worshipped the prototype as a religious figure, and still others like Giblet, who retained moral complexity and capacity for both kindness and violence depending on circumstances. The protagonist's role in this conflict remains ambiguous in ways that Chapter 5 reinforces rather than resolving. We're called the Playtime Butcher because we've left a trail of destroyed toys throughout the factory, but those toys were trying to kill us, were obstacles to survival, were threats that needed to be eliminated. We've been manipulated by the prototype, used as an unwitting agent in destroying Safe Haven, but we were also trying to survive in an environment where nearly everything wants to kill us. We have the opportunity to ally with Sawyer, but doing so means cooperating with someone who was directly responsible for the transformation of countless children into toys. The series has consistently avoided giving us clear moral high ground, has refused to let us be simple heroes fighting obvious evil. It has instead positioned us as someone trying to survive in a morally complicated situation, where every action has consequences that ripple outward in ways we can't fully predict or control. This positioning suggests that Chapter 6's conclusion, however it resolves the physical threats and immediate dangers, will also require us to make choices about what we think should happen to the factory and its remaining inhabitants. Choices that won't have clear right answers, but which will reflect different values about consciousness, identity, agency, and justice. The poppy gel's mutagenic properties and its permanent presence in our system after the immersion creates another potential direction for the story. We're now contaminated with the same substance that enables the bigger body's transformations, carrying traces of it that might gradually alter our biology in unpredictable ways, and this could be set up for our own eventual transformation, becoming another experiment whether we want to or not, crossing the line from observer to participant in the horror we've been documenting. Or it might give us unique capabilities, allowing us to interface with the factory systems in ways normal humans can't, turning the contamination into an asset rather than merely a threat. The implication that there might be a Chapter 6 and potentially beyond, rather than Chapter 5 serving as the series' conclusion as many expected, opens possibilities for exploring locations and characters we haven't yet encountered. The factory is enormous, with entire sections never visited in the 5 chapters released so far. There are mentioned experiments who never appear directly, toys referenced in documents who might still be surviving in sealed sections or hidden spaces. There's the outside world beyond the factory's walls, which must have some awareness of what happened here, even if official investigations were suppressed or abandoned. Mob Entertainment's confirmation that the series will continue beyond Chapter 5 proves that there are plans to explore these possibilities, to expand the story in ways that the current chapter's cliffhanger enables. Whether this means another year or more of waiting for Chapter 6, whether it means the story will extend to the theoretical 10 chapters that some community members speculate about, whether it means expanding into other media beyond games, remains to be seen. But Chapter 5's ending makes clear that the story isn't over, that major questions remain unanswered, that the factory's secrets extend deeper than we've yet explored. The community's reaction to Chapter 5 has been largely positive, with praise for the improved gameplay mechanics and the atmospheric environments, the voice acting performances, and the narrative revelations that recontextualize the entire series. The pressure hand and conductive hand additions to the grab pack open up puzzle possibilities that weren't available in previous chapters, creating more complex environmental interactions while still maintaining the series' accessibility to players who aren't experts at puzzle games. The chase sequences feel more refined than in earlier chapters, with better pacing and clearer visual communication about what players need to do to survive. But there's also been criticism from some community members about the chapter not providing enough resolution, about feeling like a middle chapter rather than a potential conclusion, about leaving too many threads dangling for a series that's already been running for several years. And the debate about whether Chapter 5 successfully advances the story or merely prolongs it reflects different player preferences about pacing and structure in episodic games, about whether the journey is more important than the destination, or whether, at some point, narrative momentum requires moving toward conclusion rather than expansion. The technical improvements in Chapter 5 compared to previous chapters shouldn't be overlooked. The game runs more smoothly, art with better optimization that prevents the performance issues and bugs that plagued earlier releases at launch. The environments are more detailed and atmospheric, taking advantage of improved lighting systems and more sophisticated asset placement to create spaces that feel authentically decayed and disturbing. The animation work has been refined, particularly for the prototype and Lily Lovebraids, giving them fluid motion that makes their mechanical nature more believable and threatening. And voice acting reaches new heights with Nicole Tompkins' performance as Lily Lovebraids, capturing the character's manic energy and psychological fracture through vocal choices that shift between childlike innocence and adult rage without warning. The way she can pivot from cheerful game show host to screaming predator in a single breath creates genuine unease that pure visual horror couldn't achieve alone. Similarly, and the prototype's synthesized voice work creates menace through restraint rather than bombast, with calm, measured tones that make his threats more frightening than if he were shouting or raging. Conclusion and call to action. We've descended through 5 chapters into the darkest depths of Playtime Co. From the cheerful facade of Chapter 1's lobby, through the game stations and playcare and safe haven, to finally reach these laboratories where the real work happened, where consciousness was transferred and bodies were transformed and children became toys through science that crossed every ethical boundary. Chapter 5. Broken Things earned its title by showing us just how thoroughly this place and its inhabitants were broken, how trauma and transformation and decades of isolation shattered whatever might have been salvageable after the hour of joy. The revelation that the prototype is Oliver Ludwig, that he was Elliot's first experiment and Poppy's brother, reframes every interaction we've had with him across all previous chapters. He's not some mysterious evil, but rather a tragic figure whose suffering created the monster he became, whose transformation robbed him of humanity while preserving intelligence and memory and the capacity to plan revenge that took decades to fully execute. Understanding his origin creates sympathy without excusing his actions. It makes him more terrible rather than less by proving that consciousness can survive complete corruption of the substrate that contains it. Lily Lovebraids represents the other side of that tragedy, showing what happens when Playtime Co.'s psychological warfare turns inward, when the torturer becomes victim of her own techniques, when breaking someone's mind is so complete that nothing remains but fragments that don't connect coherently. Her Tea Party delusions and desperate need for approval are simultaneously pitiful and horrifying, proving that some transformations can't be reversed or healed, that some damage persists forever in mechanical bodies that can't die and release their inhabitants from suffering. The hour of joy emerges as more complex than previous chapters suggested, not purely a rebellion of victims against oppressors, but also a calculated operation orchestrated by the prototype, using sympathetic staff members who thought they were helping end experiments when they were actually enabling a massacre. The moral ambiguity of this event, the recognition that justified resistance and cruel revenge exist simultaneously in the same actions, prevents any simple interpretation of whether the toys were heroes or villains in rising against their creators. Dr. Harley Sawyer's survival as digital consciousness opens possibilities for Chapter 6 that weren't available before, creating potential alliances and threats that complicate the straightforward goal of defeating the prototype and escaping the factory. His offer of cooperation in exchange for help accessing resources he can't reach from isolation in the server room forces uncomfortable questions about whether working with evil to prevent greater evil is justified, and whether the ends justify the means when survival is at stake. Whether there's any moral high ground available in situations where every choice involves compromise. The poppy gel's properties and the protagonist's contamination with it create setup for future developments that might transform our role from observer to participant in the horror, from someone trying to escape the factory to someone who might become permanently part of it through involuntary transformation. The mutagenic substance that enabled the Bigger Bodies initiative now flows in our veins in trace amounts that might grow, might spread, might eventually trigger changes we can't predict or control. This contamination makes escape less meaningful because we're carrying the factory's horror with us, because leaving doesn't guarantee safety or freedom from transformation. Ghibli and the other intelligent experiments who retain capacity for thought and moral judgment represent possibilities for the factory's future beyond the binary of prototypes' tyranny or total destruction. They've built lives in the ruins, created communities and relationships and purposes that give meaning to existence that should be meaningless. Their presence argues that mechanical immortality doesn't automatically create horror, and that consciousness preserved in artificial substrates can still experience something worth calling life, that the experiments deserve agency over their own futures, rather than having outsiders decide what happens to them. Chapter 5 doesn't resolve the story, but rather opens it wider, introducing complications and questions that make simple conclusions impossible, creating moral complexity that prevents easy answers about what should happen to the factory and its inhabitants. This expansion rather than resolution will frustrate players who wanted closure, but it also demonstrates confidence that the story has enough depth and interest to sustain continued development, that there are threads worth pulling and secrets worth revealing in whatever chapters follow. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Chapter 5's revelations and implications, if you found value in exploring how this chapter changes everything we thought we knew about Poppy Playtime's story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. These longer analytical pieces take substantial time and research to produce, and your support through engagement helps justify continuing to create this kind of content. Let me know in the comments what revelations from Chapter 5 surprised you most. whether you think we should ally with Sawyer in Chapter 6, what you believe the prototype's ultimate goals might be, and where you think the story should go from here. And the community discussions around this chapter have been fascinating, with theories and interpretations that add dimensions I hadn't considered. And I'm genuinely curious about how different players process the information Chapter 5 provided, and what it means for understanding the series as a whole. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring the darkest corners of Playtime Company's laboratories, for descending into the depths where consciousness and mechanics blur together, for witnessing how one chapter can reshape an entire narrative. Chapter 5 stands as a watershed moment in Poppy Playtime's evolution, transforming what began as a straightforward horror game into something far more complex and philosophically challenging. The questions it raises about consciousness, identity, and the ethics of transformation technology extend beyond the fiction into real-world debates about transhumanism, about the boundaries between human and machine, as about what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of immortality or enhancement. The factory serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliant minds pursue technological advancement without ethical constraints, when corporate interests override human dignity, when the desire to transcend mortality becomes more important than respecting the humanity of those transformed in service of that goal. The careful balance Mob Entertainment has struck between horror entertainment and genuine philosophical inquiry deserves recognition. It would have been easy to make this just another mascot horror game, following the formula established by other successful franchises, relying on jump scares and chase sequences without deeper substance. Instead, Chapter 5 delivers genuine horror that emerges from contemplating the implications of its world, from understanding what it means to have your consciousness forcibly transferred into mechanical form, from recognizing that the experiments aren't just monsters, but were once children who had futures stolen from them through procedures they couldn't understand or consent to. The technical achievements in this chapter, from the improved chase mechanics to the sophisticated puzzle design, to the atmospheric environments that make the laboratories feel authentically decayed and threatening, and demonstrate growth from a development team that's learned from previous iterations and applied those lessons to create their most polished entry yet. The addition of Globy as a portable audio player, the refinement of the grab pack with new hands that enable more complex puzzle solutions, the improved AI behaviors that make encounters feel less scripted and more dynamic, all contribute to gameplay that respects players' time and intelligence while still challenging them appropriately. Looking forward to Chapter 6 and whatever comes after. The foundation Chapter 5 established suggests possibilities for storytelling that could take the series in directions we haven't yet imagined. The digital survival of Dr. Harley Sawyer opens narrative possibilities about multiple copies of consciousness existing simultaneously, about the distinction between original and backup, about whether continuity of experience matters when identity can be preserved in multiple substrates. The prototype's true nature as Oliver Ludwig creates opportunities for exploring his relationship with Poppy more deeply, for understanding the sibling rivalry and resentment that has shaped both their actions, for potentially finding some resolution to their conflict that doesn't require one of them being completely destroyed. The factory itself remains largely unexplored, with entire sections mentioned in documents but never visited, with experiments referenced but never encountered, with secrets buried in places we haven't yet reached. There are suggestions of global operations beyond this single facility, hints that Playtime Co.'s reach extended far beyond what we've seen, implications that the Bigger Bodies initiative might have had implementations in multiple locations that could still be active or at least explorable. The story's expansion beyond the immediate survival horror of escaping Huggy Wuggy has created space for a much larger narrative about corporate malfeasance, about scientific ethics, about the cost of technological advancement when human subjects become raw materials for progress. Until next time, when we'll explore whatever revelations Chapter 6 brings, remember that some experiments should never be conducted, that some lines should never be crossed, and that the price of mechanical immortality might be everything that makes existence worth preserving. The story of Playtime Company reminds us that love without wisdom becomes monstrous, that scientific advancement without ethical constraints creates horror, that the desire to transcend human limitations can lead to abandoning humanity itself. These lessons extend beyond fiction into our own world, where similar technologies are being developed, where similar questions about consciousness transfer and mechanical enhancement are moving from theoretical to practical, where we must decide what boundaries we want to maintain before the technology exists to cross them. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be undisturbed by visions of mechanical immortality and the horrors it brings.